They thought grief had made me small. That was their first mistake. At my husband Richard's funeral, I stood beneath the gray March sky outside St. Matthew's in Hartford, holding a program with his name printed in careful black script, and for the first time in 41 years, I felt like a guest in my own life. The church doors were open. People moved in and out with lowered voices, polished shoes, and casseroles wrapped in foil. I wore the same black coat I had saved for serious occasions for nearly a decade. The one Richard used to say made me look dignified. To Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, it seemed to mean something else. She looked at me once, then at the coat, then at the handbag I had carried for years, and her expression settled into that thin, practiced sympathy people use when they believe someone has already lost everything worth keeping. "We'll make sure she's taken care of," I heard her whisper to one of Richard's cousins near the flower stand. Not cruel enough to be called cruel, just loud enough to be heard. I did not turn around. I did not give her that satisfaction. I only folded the funeral program once, very neatly, and kept walking. The sanctuary smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish. Richard loved that church. He said it was one of the last places in the city that still knew how to be quiet. I used to sit beside him in the third pew from the front, always on the left, because the stained glass window threw blue light across his shoulder during morning service. That day, the third pew was full. Vanessa had arranged the seating herself. Daniel, my son, stood near the aisle with his jaw set tight, greeting people in the dark navy suit I had bought him years ago when he got his first job in finance. He hugged everyone else for a second longer than he hugged me. "Mom," he said softly, as if I were fragile glass. Then he guided me toward the fourth row, beside Richard's sister and her husband, as though I belonged among the extended relatives and not beside the coffin of the man who had shared my bed, my bills, my children, and my entire adult life. That was when I understood this was not just a funeral. It was a rearrangement. A quiet one, a strategic one, and I was the only person in the room who seemed to notice it happening in real time. Vanessa moved through the church like a woman hosting a charity luncheon. Her black dress was expensive, understated, the kind of understated that costs real money. She adjusted flower cards, thanked people for coming, accepted condolences with her head tilted just enough to seem gracious. Every few minutes, she touched Daniel's arm, steering him from one conversation to the next. It was subtle, almost elegant. If you did not know her, you might have mistaken it for support. If you did know her, you saw what it was. Positioning. Her eyes kept drifting back to me, not with concern, but with calculation, as if she were measuring how much resistance a widow my age could still offer. I sat down without a word. My hands were steady. That surprised even me. 3 days earlier, I had still been holding Richard's hand in a hospital room where the machines had gone quiet one by one. I had watched the final breath leave his body with less fear than I expected and more emptiness than I thought a human chest could carry. But this was different. Death was honest. This was not. This was theater in pearls and black silk and lowered voices. This was the beginning of something they thought I was too tired to see. A woman from our neighborhood slid into the pew beside me and squeezed my hand. "You must let Daniel help you with everything now," she said gently. "These things can be overwhelming." I gave her a small smile. People always reveal more than they mean to when they think they are comforting you. Help with what? The bills, the house, the accounts, the decisions, the future. I had not mentioned money. Not to her. Not to anyone. Yet by the time the organ began its slow opening hymn, the air around me was already thick with assumptions. Poor Evelyn. Old Evelyn. Widowed Evelyn. A woman in a sensible coat who would soon need guidance. I lowered my eyes to the program again and read Richard's full name as if it might anchor me. Then I saw a pair of black heels stop in the aisle beside my pew. "Vanessa." She leaned down, perfume soft and expensive, and asked in a whisper coated with sweetness, "Are you comfortable back here, Evelyn?" Back here. Not up front. Not where a wife belongs. I looked up at her. Really looked. At the careful makeup. The perfect posture. The confidence of a woman who believed the story had already been decided. And I smiled the way Richard taught me to smile during negotiations, slow and unreadable. "For now," I said. That was all. But something in my voice made her blink. Just once. Then she straightened, smoothed her dress, and walked away. The service had not even begun, and already they were treating me like I was broke, helpless, and nearly finished. I let them. I let every glance pass over me. I let every soft insult land where they thought it would bruise. Because grief had taken my husband. It had not taken my memory. It had not taken my judgment. And it certainly had not taken the one thing none of them, yet knew I still had complete control over, $28 million. By the time the final hymn ended, the church had begun to empty in careful layers, the way people always leave funerals in America, slowly at first, then all at once, like someone had opened a gate. The older friends came to me with watery eyes and gentle hands. Richard's former business associates came with firm handshakes and polished condolences. A few women from our neighborhood brought aluminum trays and soft voices and offered the kind of help that sounds kind until you listen closely enough to hear the assumption beneath it. They all looked at me as though I had crossed some invisible line overnight, as though widowhood had moved me from being Richard Carter's wife to being a woman whose future would need to be managed by younger, steadier hands. Vanessa seemed to understand that mood in the room instinctively and decided to use it. She stood near the receiving line with Daniel, collecting sympathy as if it were something she had organized and paid for. Every few minutes she stepped in before I could answer a question. If someone asked whether there would be a family gathering afterward, Vanessa answered. If they asked whether the house would stay in the family, Vanessa answered that too, with a smile so smooth it almost passed for grace. We are keeping things simple for Evelyn, she said to a couple from Richard's law firm. She does not need to worry about any of the details right now. She said my name like I was not standing 6 feet away. She said it the way people talk about an aging aunt who gets confused by restaurant bills and television remotes. Daniel did not correct her. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed defending in that moment, but because silence from your own child has a way of sounding louder than any insult a stranger can offer. I watched him nod at things that had not been discussed with me. I watched him carry himself with the nervous seriousness of a man trying to look responsible while someone else supplies the script. He had Richard's height, but none of his stillness. Richard could stand in a room full of noise and somehow never be moved by it. Daniel absorbed every current around him. That had always been his weakness. As people continued to drift out toward the parking lot, I remained where I was, exchanging thanks, accepting hugs, and taking mental notes. A funeral tells you a great deal about the living if you stop looking at the flowers and start looking at the faces. Vanessa was not grieving the way a person grieves when they have lost someone central. She was busy, efficient, alert. She kept checking the time on her phone. She repositioned sympathy cards into neat stacks. She gently redirected one of Richard's golfing friends away from me before he could finish saying he had meant to call me about a trust meeting Richard had postponed in February. That small interruption landed harder than it should have. Not because of what the man said, but because of how quickly Vanessa stepped in, like someone guarding a doorway she should not have known existed. I stored that away. Then came the moment that told me I was not imagining any of it. Richard's cousin Marlene, who had never learned the difference between concern and gossip, touched my sleeve near the church entrance and said, "Do not worry, honey. Daniel will make sure you land somewhere comfortable. Somewhere comfortable. Not home. Not your home. Somewhere." I looked past her and saw Vanessa speaking quietly to the funeral director while Daniel signed a clipboard. The image stopped me cold. There he was, pen in hand, authorizing things with the solemn expression of a man stepping into his father's place. He did not look over once to ask whether the choices reflected what Richard and I would have wanted. He signed because Vanessa had placed the paper in front of him, and because grief makes weak people confuse activity with wisdom. I said nothing. I thanked Marlene for coming. I buttoned my coat. Outside, the wind had sharpened. Connecticut in early spring always promises warmth before it earns it. Black sedans lined the curb. A few guests stood in clusters, speaking in low voices beneath a pale sky. I could feel Vanessa approaching before I turned. "The family is coming back to the house for a small reception," she said. "Just immediate people. I thought it would be easier if Daniel and I handled the food and the setup. You should just go home and rest before everyone arrives." Again with that tone. Careful. Protective. Excluding. She had already decided my own kitchen would be her staging ground. My own dining room would be arranged by her hands. I pictured her in my house, opening cabinets, moving platters, making little comments to relatives about what should be kept and what should be donated once things settled down. I could practically hear it. Poor Evelyn cannot manage that place on her own. It is too much house now. Too much upkeep. Too many memories. People always dress control in the language of concern. That is thoughtful, I said. But I am coming home now. She held my gaze for half a second too long. It was a small thing, but in that half second I saw her irritation flicker through the polish. Of course, she said. I just thought you might be tired. I am, I told her. But tired is not the same as absent. Daniel joined us then, keys in hand, looking relieved to find us both using pleasant voices. I can drive you, Mom, he said. I looked at him and saw the boy who used to wait by the front window when Richard traveled, counting minutes until his father's car pulled into the driveway. That boy had once trusted me without hesitation. The man standing before me now could not seem to decide whether I was his mother or his next obligation. I drove myself, I said. I will meet you there. Vanessa gave Daniel a quick look. One of those swift married looks that says plenty without using words. Then she smiled at me again, and there it was, the expression I had seen all morning, a quiet certainty that I was no longer central to anything that mattered. She was wrong, of course, but I was beginning to understand just how wrong, and more important, how soon I would need proof. I walked down the church steps alone, the wind pressing against my coat, the parking lot stretching out before me in strips of gray light. Behind me, I could hear doors opening, voices rising, car engines turning over. They thought the service was over. They thought the hard part had passed. They thought I would go home, sit quietly in my own house, and let them tell me what came next. But as I reached my car and placed my hand on the cold metal of the door handle, one thought settled in me with perfect clarity. Richard had spent too many years building our life to leave me defenseless inside it, and whatever Vanessa was planning, she had started too early for someone who still believed I had no idea what I was worth. The drive back to the house took less than 15 minutes, but by the time I pulled into the circular driveway, it felt as though I had crossed out of one life and into another. The stone colonial Richard and I had bought nearly 20 years earlier stood exactly as it always had, dignified and quiet behind the bare maples, its white trim bright against the late afternoon gray. Yet there was something altered in the way I looked at it that day, as if grief had stripped the sentiment from every familiar line and left only structure behind. The front door would open. People would step inside. Voices would carry into the foyer. Coats would land on chairs. Trays would appear on the kitchen counters. But under all of that ordinary funeral ritual, something colder had already started moving through the rooms. I could feel it before I even turned off the engine. When I entered through the mudroom, the house was still empty, and for a moment I stood there in the silence, one gloved hand resting on the counter by the laundry sink, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the long case. Clock in the hall. Richard had insisted on buying that clock at an estate auction up in Vermont. He said a good house should have one object that reminded people time was not theirs to command. He was right. That day, each second seemed louder than usual. I took off my coat, hung it carefully, and walked through the kitchen, straightening nothing, touching nothing, only looking. The fruit bowl on the island. The blue ceramic pitcher by the sink. Richard's reading glasses still folded on the breakfast table where he had left them before his last hospital stay. Vanessa would arrive soon and see a house full of details she would mistake for disorder, the way younger people often do when they have no patience for the logic of someone else's home. She would think the place needed organizing. She would think I needed guiding. The thought almost made me smile. I moved into Richard's study before anyone else could come in and fill the air with soft voices and paper plates. The room was dim, lined with walnut shelves and old framed photographs from conferences, charity dinners, and family vacations that now looked like evidence from a different century. His desk sat near the window, immaculate except for one leather folder, a brass letter opener, and the fountain pen Daniel had given him 2 Christmases ago. I knew better than to go digging wildly. Richard hated panic. He always said that when people are frightened, they reveal themselves twice, once by what they say, and once by what they rush to find. So I stood there and forced myself to think instead of search. That was when February came back to me. One rainy Thursday afternoon, about 5 weeks before he died, Richard had been sitting in this very room in a navy sweater, not well enough to go into the office but still unwilling to admit weakness. I had brought him tea and found him looking through a stack of papers with an expression I recognized from the years when he was negotiating mergers. Focused. Quiet. Final. He had asked me, very casually, whether the private line for Martin Hale still worked. Martin was our attorney, not the lawyer who handled routine closings or simple updates, but the one Richard used when something actually mattered. I remember saying yes, it still worked, and asking whether he wanted me to call. He had hesitated, then shaken his head. Not yet, he said. I just want to make sure everything is where it should be. At the time, I assumed he meant medical directives or tax planning. Men like Richard organized difficult truths into file folders. It was one of the ways they coped. But now, standing in that study with the house still quiet and the smell of church lilies clinging faintly to my clothes, I heard that sentence differently. Everything is where it should be. Not everything. Something specific. Something important enough for him to check, but not discuss in front of anyone else. A car door slammed outside. Then another. I heard voices in the driveway. Vanessa had arrived with Daniel and 2 catering trays from some upscale market in West Hartford, no doubt because she wanted everything to look tasteful and effortless, as though mourning itself could be curated. I left the study without touching the desk and met them in the kitchen. Vanessa came in first, carrying a platter and already talking. I brought roasted salmon, tea sandwiches, and lemon bars, she said, setting things down like a woman presenting order to a household on the verge of collapse. I thought simple would be best. Daniel followed behind her with flowers from the church and a cardboard box of sympathy cards. He looked tired now, truly tired, and for one brief second I felt sorry for him. Then Vanessa asked, without so much as glancing up, "Where do you keep the nicer serving trays? Not may I use them. Not would you like anything set out. Where do you keep them?" The ownership in that question was almost elegant. I opened a cabinet and pointed. "Top shelf." She nodded as if that settled something larger than China. Within minutes, she had my kitchen moving to her rhythm. Platters came out. Napkins were arranged. Wine glasses were relocated, though no wine had been served. Daniel placed the box of cards by the refrigerator and began discussing parking with one of Richard's cousins over speakerphone. I stood near the island and watched the performance take shape. A stranger might have thought Vanessa was helping. A wiser person would have seen that she was mapping the room. Cabinets, drawers, silver, crystal, traffic flow, weak points. People tell themselves that greed always arrives looking vulgar. It rarely does. Most of the time it arrives in cashmere, carrying lemon bars, speaking in a voice so reasonable you almost feel ashamed for distrusting it. More guests began to arrive, and the house filled with that strange post-funeral murmur, half memory, half appetite. I accepted condolences, hugged old friends, and listened to stories about Richard that all ended with some version of how dependable he had been. Through it all, Vanessa kept stepping into conversations at odd moments, especially when money, the house, or Richard's business life came near the surface. When one former colleague mentioned a postponed trust review, she redirected him toward the food table before he could say more. When one of our neighbors asked whether I planned to stay in the house, Vanessa answered from across the room. "We are going to look at what makes the most sense," she said brightly. "We." That single word settled over the room like dust. Not Evelyn will decide. Not the family will talk. We. I looked at her then, really looked, and I realized the first move had already been made. She was not waiting for grief to pass. She was using it as cover. And standing there in my own kitchen, with my husband barely buried and my daughter-in-law speaking as if she already held the keys to my future, I understood that Richard had not simply been organizing papers in February. He had seen something coming. The only question now was how much he had seen, and whether he had left me enough to stop it before their concern hardened into control. That evening stretched long after the last casserole tray had been covered and the last polite voice had faded down the front walk. One by one, the guests took their coats, pressed my hand, and told me to call if I needed anything, which is what people say when they want to offer kindness without inviting responsibility. By a little after 8, only Daniel and Vanessa remained. The house had gone quieter in the way a house does after too many people have tried to fill it, almost relieved to be left alone again. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen. A lamp near the staircase cast a pool of amber light across the foyer. Somewhere upstairs, one of the old floorboards settled with a soft creak. I stood near the dining room doorway holding a stack of sympathy cards I had no intention of reading that night, while Vanessa moved through my kitchen as though she had already memorized the weight of every drawer. Daniel was rinsing glasses at the sink, shoulders slightly hunched, his tie loosened, looking like a man who had mistaken exhaustion for virtue. "You should not stay too late," I said, keeping my voice level. "It has been a long day." Vanessa dried her hands and gave me that practiced expression again, the one designed to look warm from a distance and managerial up close. "We actually thought this might be a good time to go over a few things while everything is still fresh," she said. There it was. Not tomorrow. Not next week. The same day I buried my husband, my daughter-in-law wanted to go over a few things. Daniel turned off the faucet and reached for a dish towel, avoiding my eyes. "Just basic stuff, Mom," he said. "Nothing major." Men always say that when they are about to place something major in front of you and hope softness will do the heavy lifting. Vanessa crossed to the kitchen island and laid down a slim folder from her tote bag. Beige. Unlabeled. Deliberately non-threatening. She opened it with the care of someone setting down dessert plates. "There are just some practical matters that cannot wait forever," she said. "Utilities, homeowner insurance, access to the accounts Richard used for household expenses, things like that. We were thinking it would make sense if Daniel helped oversee the transition for a while." I did not move. The folder remained closed between us. "Oversee what exactly?" I asked. Vanessa smiled, but it came a second too late. "Just until everything settles. You have been through a lot." "That does not answer my question." Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, nobody is trying to push you into anything. We just want to make sure bills are handled and maybe talk about whether this house is too much for one person now." There it was again. The house. Not my health. Not dinner. Not whether I had slept. The house. Large homes have a way of tempting small people into big assumptions. I looked from my son to the folder and back again. "And who decided this discussion belonged tonight?" I asked, after the funeral, in my kitchen, with paperwork I have not seen. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Vanessa answered instead. "We are trying to protect you from stress, Evelyn." I almost admired the precision of that sentence. It placed me beneath her while sounding considerate. It turned my authority into a burden she could generously remove. I set the sympathy cards down on the sideboard and walked to the island. Up close, I could see the edge of a bank logo through one of the folder sleeves and a typed page beneath it with signature lines flagged in pale yellow tabs. She had come prepared. Not just emotionally prepared. Administratively prepared. "Did Richard ask for this?" I said. Vanessa glanced at Daniel before speaking. "Richard wanted Daniel involved." "That is not what I asked." A small silence opened. In that silence, I saw something I had not fully let myself see before. Vanessa was not improvising out of grief or nerves. She had a plan. Maybe not every detail, but enough of one to arrive at my house on the day of my husband's funeral with organized paperwork and the confidence to act as if delay itself would be unreasonable. My mind moved backward again, to the weeks before Richard died. There had been small things at the time that barely registered. Vanessa insisting on attending a doctor appointment Daniel was not even required to join. Daniel calling twice in 1 week to ask whether the property tax statements still came by mail or electronically. Richard growing unexpectedly quiet one Sunday afternoon when Daniel mentioned how complicated estate issues had become for one of Vanessa's friends. I had taken each moment separately. That was my mistake. Separate things are easy to dismiss. Together, they form a shape. I reached out and closed the folder without opening it. "I am not signing anything tonight," I said. Daniel looked up at last. "Mom, nobody said you had to sign it tonight." "Then there is no reason for it to be open on my counter." Vanessa folded her hands. "Of course. We only thought it might reassure you to know that Daniel can help manage certain details if needed." "If needed by whom?" I asked. Again, Daniel said nothing. His silence no longer sounded uncertain to me. It sounded chosen. Not malicious, perhaps. Not yet. But chosen all the same. I picked up the folder and held it for a moment, feeling the neat thickness of clipped papers, the smooth finish of prepared forms, the cool little certainty of people who had confused access with entitlement. Then I handed it back to Vanessa. "Leave me copies," I said. "I will review them myself." Her face changed almost imperceptibly. Not enough for Daniel to notice, perhaps, but enough for me. It was the expression of a woman who had expected compliance and run into process instead. "There is no rush," she said too quickly. "Good," I replied. "Then you will not mind waiting." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward the dark window above the sink. Outside, The yard lights glowed softly over the stone path Richard had installed himself one summer because he did not trust contractors to care about symmetry. I thought of him then with such force that my throat tightened, not from helplessness, but from recognition. He had been trying to tell me something in pieces because he knew pieces were safer around the wrong people. He had not wanted alarm. He had wanted readiness. Vanessa slipped the folder back into her tote bag, but the moment had already done its work. I knew now that whatever was coming had not begun with the funeral. The funeral had only given them cover to move faster. And as Daniel gathered his coat and Vanessa checked whether she had left any serving utensils in the kitchen drawer beside the stove, I understood one thing with perfect certainty. They did not see me as a wife protecting the life she built with her husband. They saw me as a tired older woman standing between them and something they had already started counting. The next morning, the house woke before I did. Not with noise exactly, but with absence. Richard's side of the bed remained smooth, the indentation already gone from the mattress, and the quiet had a different texture now, less like mourning and more like a warning that whatever came next would arrive in ordinary daylight. I made coffee in the blue ceramic pot we had used for years, fed the cat, and stood at the kitchen window watching the back lawn silver over with a thin layer of frost that would vanish by 10. The routine steadied me. Grief does not always come as sobbing. Sometimes it arrives as a hand reaching for a second mug you no longer need. By 8:30, I had already done something Vanessa and Daniel clearly did not expect of me. I had taken out the folder from the night before, spread the documents across the breakfast table, and read every page slowly, twice. The first set of papers concerned limited access to one of the household operating accounts, the one Richard used for recurring expenses, landscaping, utilities, maintenance, groceries, charitable subscriptions, and minor travel arrangements. Harmless on the surface. The second was framed as a temporary convenience authorization, giving Daniel permission to communicate with our financial institutions on my behalf should I become, as the language put it, overwhelmed by bereavement-related administrative duties. A thoughtful phrase, neat and respectable. But thoughtful phrases are often where control begins in families like ours. Once someone gets used to speaking for you, they rarely volunteer to stop. At 9:15, my phone rang. Vanessa. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning, Evelyn, she said, bright and composed, as though she had not tried to place signature tabs under my hand less than 12 hours after I buried my husband. I just wanted to check in and see how you were holding up. I am upright and dressed, I said. That is a solid start. She gave a small laugh, though nothing I said had been intended as humor. Daniel was thinking about stopping by after lunch. There are just a few account details he can help streamline before things pile up. Streamline. Another polished word. I took my coffee to the study doorway and looked in at Richard's desk. I reviewed the documents, I said. Silence. Only for a second, but enough. That was quick, she answered. Well, I thought it might ease your mind. It clarified a few things. Such as, the question came too fast. I could almost see her straighten where she was standing, probably in her immaculate kitchen, one hand around a travel mug, already dressed for efficiency. Such as the fact that your definition of temporary grants broader access than your tone suggests, I said. And such as the fact that I do not recall asking for oversight. Her voice softened. Not warmer. Softer. Evelyn, nobody is trying to take over. Daniel only wants to make sure nothing slips through the cracks while you are dealing with everything emotionally. There it was again. Emotionally. As though feeling deeply and thinking. Clearly could not happen inside the same woman over 60. Nothing is slipping, I said. Then perhaps it would help if Daniel came anyway, she replied. Just to sit down and review what is out there. Property taxes. Insurance renewals. Investment distributions. The house itself. Always the house. That repetition had become too deliberate to ignore. I moved into the study and rested my fingertips lightly on the back of Richard's chair. Why are you so interested in whether I remain in this house? I asked. This time, the silence lasted longer. I am not interested in that, she said at last. I am interested in making sure you are not burdened by more than you can manage. I have managed this house for 19 years. With Richard? Yes, I said. With my husband. That tends to be how marriage works. She did not like that. I could hear it in the controlled inhale that followed. Daniel will come by at 1, she said, shifting from persuasion to assumption so smoothly another person might not have noticed. He can bring lunch. Daniel is welcome to visit me as my son, I said. If he arrives as my supervisor, he can turn around and leave. I ended the call before she could reframe it. Then I stood very still in the study, listening to the blood move behind my ears. She had revealed more in 5 minutes than she intended. The account papers mattered, yes, but not enough to explain her urgency. The house mattered more. Access mattered more. Establishing authority mattered most. I sat down at Richard's desk for the first time since he died and opened the top right drawer. Inside were fountain pen cartridges, spare reading glasses, old Christmas stamps, and a legal pad with 2 pages torn off cleanly from the front. In the back corner lay a small leather address book Richard refused to replace with a phone app because, as he liked to say, batteries die and paper does not betray you. I flipped to the H section and found Martin Hale's direct number, still written in Richard's narrow blue handwriting. I did not call immediately. Instead, I went back to the breakfast table and reviewed the paperwork a 3rd time, paying attention now not only to what it granted, but to what it normalized. Once Daniel became the contact person, financial staff would begin. Looking to him first. Once he spoke for me once, he could do it again. Once Vanessa learned which institutions handled what, she would know where to press next. The cleverness of it was not in the documents themselves. It was in the sequence. Establish access. Create dependence. Raise the issue of upkeep. Suggest downsizing. Frame every surrender as relief. By 11, the frost outside had melted and the sun had turned the back terrace bright enough to hurt my eyes. I closed the folder, placed it in a drawer they would not think to check, and finally picked up the phone to call Martin Hale. If Richard had seen this coming, he would not have left me only fear. He would have left me structure. And if there was one lesson 41 years of marriage to that man had taught me, it was this. Richard never built anything important without making sure the foundation could survive a very elegant kind of betrayal. Martin Hale answered on the 2nd ring, and the sound of his voice did something I had not expected. It steadied me. Not because he sounded warm. Martin had never confused warmth with usefulness. He sounded the way he always had, precise, measured, and faintly impatient with the passage of time. Evelyn, he said. No performative softness. No lowered funeral tone. Just my name. I was expecting your call. I sat down in Richard's chair and looked out at the back lawn, where 2 late robins were pecking at the thawing ground near the stone wall. That suggests Richard expected it too, I said. He did. Martin did not waste words. He asked whether I was alone, whether anyone had access to Richard's study, and whether I had signed anything since Richard's death. I answered each question carefully. Alone, yes. Access, limited. Signed, nothing. Good, he said. Then listen to me closely. Richard made several adjustments in February. He was concerned that grief might be used to create pressure. The sentence was so calm it almost missed its mark. Almost. I felt my grip tighten around the arm of the chair. He said that. He said he wanted to reduce the number of ways in which anyone could persuade you to surrender control while you were in shock. Martin paused, then added, he was specific about family dynamics. Outside, a breeze moved through the bare branches beyond. The terrace. I had the odd sensation that the whole house had leaned closer to hear him. What exactly did he change? I asked. Papers shifted on his end of the line. I could picture his office in downtown Hartford without effort. The dark cabinets, the framed degrees, the windows overlooking the river, and the severe little lamp on his credenza that Richard used to joke looked more suitable for interrogations than estate work. The short version, Martin said, is that the core family assets are not exposed in the way Daniel or anyone else might assume. Richard transferred final decision authority on the principal trust structure to you as sole controlling beneficiary and co-trust manager with immediate effect upon his death. There is also a private holding vehicle and a liquidity reserve that sit outside the ordinary household accounts. Combined, the current value is just over $28 million. The number did not shock me as much as it should have. That was the strange thing. Richard and I had built a large life over 4 decades. I knew he had money tied up in investments, partnerships, and long-held positions. I knew enough to know we were not dependent on the checking account Vanessa kept circling like a bird over a shallow pond. But hearing the totals spoken aloud, hearing that it sat under my control and not somewhere within easy reach of Daniel's nervous good intentions or Vanessa's organized concern, changed the air in the room. It took something vague and made it solid. Why did he not tell Daniel? I asked. Martin was quiet for a moment. Because he no longer trusted Daniel to separate loyalty from influence, he said. And because he was concerned that if Daniel knew the exact structure, other people would know it very soon afterward. Other people. Martin never used names he did not need to use. He did not have to. Did Richard believe they were planning something? I asked. Richard believed that certain conversations around him had become too interested in access, timing, and simplification. He did not accuse anyone of a crime, Evelyn, if that is what you are asking. He simply saw enough to harden the walls before he got too weak to do it properly. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was. Not paranoia. Not my imagination, sharpened by loss. Richard had seen that. Same pattern. He had just moved faster than they realized. There is more, Martin said. In the event anyone attempts to represent you, authorize movement of assets on your behalf, pressure a sale of the residence through family influence, or secure advisory access without your written directive, my office is to intervene immediately. Richard was unusually clear about that. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The house around me no longer felt vulnerable. It felt watched over. Not emotionally. Structurally. Richard had done what he always did when he saw trouble approaching. He had not argued with it. He had built around it. What do you need from me? I asked. First, do not discuss the number with anyone, Martin said. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not friends who think they are being helpful. Let assumptions remain assumptions. Second, bring me every document they ask you to sign. Third, if anyone starts discussing a sale, a transfer, or oversight, you notify me before you respond. And fourth, there is a sealed instruction packet in your safe deposit file at First Union Private Bank. Richard asked that you review it only after speaking with me. There is a packet in the bank. I asked. Yes. He prepared it 2 weeks before his final hospitalization. It includes letters, trust diagrams, and a record of why he made the revisions he made. That landed differently than the money. Money is power, yes, but letters are memory with intention. If Richard had written something for me to read after his death, then somewhere inside that envelope was the clearest version of what he feared, what he saw, and what he trusted me to do next. I stood and walked to the bookshelf, running my fingers lightly over the spines as if they might keep me anchored. Daniel is coming by later, I said. Vanessa has been pushing for account access and framing it as temporary help. Then do not refuse emotionally, Martin said. Refuse procedurally. Ask for copies. Say you are reviewing things. Delay without signaling what you know. People reveal the most when they think they are close. That sounded exactly like Richard. Or perhaps that was why Richard had trusted Martin for so long. There is one more thing, Martin added. Richard amended the ownership provisions on the residence. The house does not pass through Daniel. It remains under your control entirely unless you choose otherwise. No one can talk you into losing it unless you agree to the first small step. I looked around the study then, at the leather chair opposite the desk, at the framed black and white photograph from our trip to Maine, at the brass lamp Richard turned on every winter afternoon around 4. And for the first time since the funeral, my grief stopped feeling like a weakness other people could step around. It became something else. A line. A standard. A duty to the life Richard and I had built with too much discipline to let it be picked apart by polished voices carrying folders and sympathy. Thank you, I said. Do not thank me yet, Martin replied. Just stay quiet and watch carefully. After I hung up, I remained standing in the middle of the study, listening to the house settle around me. $28 million. Full control of the trust structure. The residence secured. A packet waiting at the bank. None of it needed to be spoken out loud for it to change everything. That was the beauty of real protection. It does not announce itself. It waits. And as I looked down at Richard's desk, at the drawer where he had kept things ordinary enough to discourage curiosity, I understood what my husband had given me in the last weeks of his life. Not just wealth. Not just legal protection. He had given me time. Time to let them keep underestimating me. Time to see how far Vanessa would go. Time to find out whether Daniel still knew the difference between being a son and becoming someone else's instrument. By the time the clock in the hall struck noon, I had folded the documents, locked them away, and washed my coffee cup. Outside, the sky had cleared to a thin, cold blue. Inside, the house no longer felt uncertain. It felt patient. And for the first time since Richard died, so did I. Daniel arrived at 1:12 with a paper bag from a cafe in West Hartford and the expression of a man trying very hard to look casual inside a situation that no longer felt casual at all. I opened the door before he rang a second time. He held up the bag a little awkwardly. "Turkey on rye for you, black coffee for me," he said. I remembered. He had. For a moment, that touched something soft in me I wished had stayed quiet. Daniel had always remembered the small things when he was younger. The exact way I liked my coffee. Which scarf I wore when I had a cold. The songs I hummed when I cooked on Sunday afternoons. Memory is not the same thing as loyalty, but sometimes it can dress itself convincingly enough to make a mother hesitate. "Come in," I said. He stepped into the foyer, looked around as if confirming the house was still standing, and followed me into the kitchen. The paper bag landed on the island between us. Outside, the sky had gone bright and brittle, the kind of cold New England afternoon that makes every window look cleaner than it is. I took out plates, unwrapped the sandwiches, and said nothing about Vanessa. I wanted to see whether he would mention her on his own. He did not make it 3 minutes. "Vanessa was worried about you this morning," he said, sitting down with his coffee. "She thought maybe yesterday was harder on you than you let on." "Yesterday was harder than either of you seemed to understand," I said. "That does not make me incapable of reading paperwork." He looked up sharply. There it was. The hit landed. He set down his cup. "Mom, that is not fair." "Is it not?" I took my seat across from him and folded my hands beside my plate. "You brought documents into my kitchen the night of your father's funeral. You let your wife answer questions about my house in front of guests. You both keep using the word help as if it means access." He exhaled through his nose and stared at the table for a moment. "Nobody is trying to take anything from you." That sentence would be more comforting if nobody had started circling anything of mine. He leaned back, and for a second I saw annoyance flash across his face before he smoothed it away. That was new. Daniel had spent most of his life trying to be agreeable. Irritation did not come naturally to him. It had to be coached into confidence by repetition, by someone near him telling him that his concerns were practical, necessary, adult. "This house is a lot," he said. "That is all Vanessa means. Taxes alone are substantial. Maintenance, landscaping, insurance, heating. Dad handled a lot of that." "Your father signed checks," I said. "I handled the vendors, the schedules, the property manager for the shoreline place, the insurance reviews, and half the calls he forgot to return. Do not confuse public posture with private labor." He blinked at that. People often do when a woman finally names the work they benefited from without noticing. "I know you did a lot," he said, quieter now. "I am just saying things are different." "Yes," I said. "They are. Your father is dead. That is different. But the arithmetic of my own life has not suddenly become beyond me." We ate in silence for a minute after that. The sandwich tasted like nothing. Grief had flattened everything into texture. Daniel unfolded his napkin, refolded it, then looked toward the study door. "Did Dad ever tell you how much of the financial structure was still in his name alone?" he asked. It was phrased carefully, too carefully, as though he wanted the information without appearing to ask for it. I took a sip of water. "He told me enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough not to panic because someone brings me a beige folder." He almost smiled at that, but not quite. "Vanessa thinks you are taking this personally." "It is personal. I mean more than it needs to be. Your wife walked into my home and positioned herself like a transition manager before your father's flowers had wilted," I said. "How much less personal would you like me to make it?" Daniel looked away, toward the sink, toward the back windows, anywhere but at me. "She is trying to be efficient," he said. "She knows things can get messy after a death." "Messy for whom?" I asked. He had no answer. Or perhaps he had too many. I let the silence work on him. Martin had been right. People reveal the most when they think they are close. Daniel was not clever enough to hide behind charm for long, and not cruel enough to stay comfortable in dishonesty without showing strain. After another minute he said, "There were some things Dad told me before he got really sick. Not details. Just that I should make sure you were not taken advantage of." I looked at him then, genuinely looked, and for the first time since the funeral I saw not just weakness, but confusion. Someone had been feeding him a version of events in which I was vulnerable, and he was noble. That is how these situations often work. No one starts by calling themselves greedy. They start by calling themselves responsible. And who exactly did he think might take advantage of me? I asked. Daniel rubbed his thumb against the coffee cup. He did not say. A lie, perhaps. Or half a lie, which is often more useful. Did he mention Martin Hale? I asked. That got me something. A flicker. So brief a stranger would have missed it. Maybe once or twice, he said. Why? Because if you and Vanessa intend to keep bringing me documents, you should understand something very clearly. I will not review another page without legal counsel. He stared at me. Legal counsel? Mom, we are family. Exactly, I said. And family has been unusually interested in signatures. He leaned forward then, not angry, but unsettled. You are making this sound ugly. No, I said. I am making it sound visible. The kitchen went still around us. The refrigerator motor kicked on. A delivery truck passed somewhere at the end of the street. Daniel sat back slowly, and with that one small retreat, I knew the balance had shifted. Not fully, not publicly, but enough. He had come expecting concern, maybe resistance, but not structure, not legal language, not a woman he could not guide back into softness with lunch and careful phrasing. What did Martin tell you? He asked at last. There it was. The first clean question of the afternoon. I kept my face still. Enough, I said again. Enough to know that I will decide what happens next, and enough to know that your father did not leave things unguarded. He swallowed once, then nodded in that slow, reluctant way people do when a door closes quietly in front of them and they realize it is heavier than it looked. He left half his sandwich untouched. When he rose to go, he hugged me, and this time the embrace felt less like duty and more like uncertainty. I stood in the foyer and watched him cross the driveway to his car. He did not wave before pulling away. After the sound of the engine faded, I locked the front door, walked back into the kitchen, and looked at the 2 coffee cups on the island. The house was quiet again, but no longer passive. Daniel had come to take the temperature of the room. He had left knowing he was not the only person with information. And somewhere between the first polite lie and the last uncomfortable question, I had learned something I needed more than reassurance. Vanessa might be the strategist, but Daniel was the opening through which the strategy moved. If I wanted to know how far they planned to go, I would not get that answer by confronting her too early. I would get it by letting him return home unsettled enough to tell her that whatever they thought I did not know, I knew more. The next 2 days passed without open conflict, which in families like mine usually means the conflict has simply gone indoors and changed clothes. Vanessa did not call me directly again, and that told me more than another conversation would have. She had shifted tactics. When people like Vanessa realize charm is no longer moving the walls, they stop pushing from the front and begin testing windows, side doors, and weaker hinges. Daniel texted twice, once to ask whether I had eaten and once to ask whether I wanted him to bring over a locksmith a friend recommended because, in his words, it might be wise to update the entry codes now that so many people had been in and out. Thoughtful on the surface, useful even, but I had begun hearing every offer in its second language. A locksmith meant access. An updated code meant someone deciding who had it. Help had become their favorite costume. I thanked him and told him I already had a security company I trusted. That part was true. Richard and I had used the same firm for 12 years, ever since a storm knocked out power to half the neighborhood and left the gates frozen open overnight. By Thursday morning, I had met Martin Hale in person, reviewed the trust diagrams, and opened the sealed packet from the bank in a private conference room that smelled faintly of leather and printer toner. Richard's handwriting was inside, steady and unmistakable. The first letter was only 3 pages, but I read it twice before I could continue. He did not waste words there either. He wrote that illness had made him quieter, not blinder. He wrote that in the last 6 months he had noticed too much interest in simplification, consolidation, and making things easier for Evelyn from people who had never once asked what I actually wanted. He wrote that Daniel was not a bad man, but too eager to be seen as useful by a woman who confused influence with intelligence. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, I should trust my instincts over anyone else's timetable. And then, in one line so precise it felt like hearing his voice in the room, he wrote, "The first person to treat you like an inconvenience will likely be the first person to underestimate what I left in your hands." I folded that letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, not because I was finished with it, but because I had learned enough. Richard had not only seen the pattern, he had named it. By the time I drove home, my grief had changed shape again. It no longer felt like a fog pressing in from all sides. It felt like a private chamber I could carry inside myself while the rest of me stayed clear. That afternoon, I did something Vanessa would not have expected. I invited her and Daniel to dinner on Saturday. Not a family meeting. Not a legal discussion. Dinner. I texted Daniel first. I thought we should all sit down together at the house, I wrote. Quietly. No paperwork. Just family. He replied within 4 minutes that it sounded like a good idea. Vanessa sent a separate message 20 minutes later, polished as ever. We would love that. What can we bring? I told her dessert. It was important that she arrive believing she had been welcomed back into a space she was beginning to think she could manage. Saturday came cold and bright. I kept the day simple on purpose. I made roast chicken, green beans with shallots, mashed Yukon Gold potatoes, and the lemon tart Richard liked because it was sharp enough not to taste sentimental. I set the dining room table with the good white plates, the silver Richard's mother had left us, and the linen napkins Vanessa always handled too carefully, as if old things might stain her. The house looked exactly as it always had on evenings when family came over. The fire was lit in the den. Lamps glowed low in the foyer. Music played softly from the kitchen speaker, old jazz, not loud enough to interfere with conversation. There is power in making a room feel safe just before the truth enters it. They arrived at 6:12. Daniel carried a bottle of wine. Vanessa brought a box tart from a bakery she wanted me to notice by name. She wore cream cashmere and a look of studied humility, the expression of a woman trying to appear respectful after having been mildly corrected. I greeted them warmly, took the tart, and said it looked lovely. Confusion is easiest to grow in people who expect either surrender or a fight. Calm deprives them of both. Dinner moved along almost pleasantly at first. Daniel spoke about work. Vanessa mentioned a charity event in town, and a couple we both knew who had listed their homes sooner than expected because, as she put it, big houses become such obligations later in life. I let the sentence fall without comment and asked Daniel whether he remembered the summer his father insisted on building the stone terrace wall himself because he did not trust the mason's symmetry. Daniel laughed, genuinely this time, and told the story better than I expected. For a few minutes I could see the family we had once been, not because it had returned, but because memory is often the last thing to leave a table before greed sits down in its place. We moved into the den after dinner with coffee and dessert. I poured for all three of us. Vanessa complimented the house twice in 10 minutes, which is how people begin when they are trying to sound detached from wanting it. Then Daniel set down his cup and cleared his throat. I did not look at him right away. I let him feel the weight of deciding to speak first. "Mom," he said, "Vanessa and I have been thinking there may be a sensible way to organize things before they become more complicated." Of course. There it was. Not despite the invitation, but because of it. He had mistaken my hospitality for readiness. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, fingertips around her cup, eyes alert in that careful way she believed passed for concern. "Only because we care about making sure you are comfortable," she said. "There are options that would reduce pressure for you. The house, the accounts, the responsibilities. None of this has to happen all at once, but planning early prevents mistakes." I sat back and looked at both of them, really looked, taking in Daniel's hopeful unease and Vanessa's polished appetite. They still believed I was reacting. They still believed they were leading. And as the fire shifted softly in the grate and the grandfather clock in the hall marked the quarter hour, I understood that the moment had arrived exactly as Richard knew it would. Not with shouting. Not with open cruelty. With dessert plates, careful voices, and the assumption that if they said the word comfortable often enough, I might hand them the future piece by piece and thank them for carrying it. For a moment, no one moved. The fire gave off a soft shift of heat. A spoon rested against a saucer with the faintest sound. Vanessa sat with one ankle crossed over the other, her back straight, her face arranged into that look of careful concern she believed made every intrusion seem civilized. Daniel stared into his coffee, as if the right phrasing might still save him from whatever he had agreed to help say. I let the silence stand between us until it grew heavy enough to become honest. Then I set my cup down on the side table and folded my hands in my lap. "Comfortable," I said. "That is an interesting word. You have both used it a great deal this week." Daniel looked up first. "Mom, we are only trying to think ahead." "No," I said quietly. "You are trying to decide how quickly my life can be rearranged without calling it that." Vanessa's expression changed by less than an inch, but that inch was enough. Evelyn, that is not fair, she said. Nobody is rearranging your life. We are discussing options. Sensible options. The house is large. The responsibilities are real. There are financial matters that can become complicated after a loss, especially when one spouse handled most of the structure. I turned my head and looked at her fully. Do you know what Richard handled? I asked. She opened her mouth, then paused. I know he was the primary decision-maker in many areas. Do you? I let the words rest there, not sharp, just exact. That is an assumption. You have made several. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mom, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. But this does not have to become a fight. It has not become a fight, I said. A fight would require surprise. I have not been surprised in days. That landed harder than I intended, mostly because it was true. I could see Daniel trying to find his place again, trying to decide whether this was still the conversation he came to have. Vanessa recovered first, as women like her often do. Then maybe clarity would help, she said. What exactly are you objecting to? Is it the timing? Is it the idea of reviewing accounts? Is it the possibility of making the house easier to manage? Because from where we sit, every practical suggestion has been treated like an attack. I smiled then, though not warmly. From where you sit, I said, I imagine a great many things look practical. Her fingers tightened once around the handle of her cup. Daniel noticed. That pleased me more than it should have. He needed to see that the calm in the room was not neutrality. It was control, and it was no longer hers. I stood and crossed to the writing desk near the den window. I had prepared only one thing for that evening, and I had done it not for drama, but for precision. Inside the top drawer sat a single cream folder. Not thick, not theatrical, just enough. I brought it back to my chair and laid it on the coffee table without opening it. Daniel's eyes dropped to it immediately. Vanessa's stayed on my face. You both made a mistake at the funeral, I said. Several, actually. But the first one was deciding what I must not have. The second was assuming I would not notice how quickly concern became entitlement. Neither of them spoke. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, tires whispering over cold pavement. Richard saw more than you realized in his final months, I continued. He saw the conversations, the interest in simplification, the eagerness to step in before anyone had been asked. He also saw something else. I touched the folder lightly with 2 fingers. He saw that you were both making plans based on incomplete information. Daniel went pale first. Not dramatically, just enough for the color to leave his face and not quite come back. Vanessa stayed still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer confidence. It was calculation interrupted. Mom, Daniel said carefully, what information? I looked at him for a long moment. I wanted him to hear the answer as a son, not as a participant in whatever story Vanessa had been telling him about duty and transition and stepping up. The information that matters, I said, is that I am not dependent on your oversight, your timing, your paperwork, or your approval. Richard made sure of that. Vanessa set her cup down with more control than I would have expected. Nobody said you were dependent, she replied. No, I said. You implied it. Repeatedly. At the church. In this house. In every sentence dressed up as help. Then, because there are moments in life when truth works best without decoration, I opened the folder and removed a single summary page from Martin Hale's office. I did not hand it to them. I held it where both could see the heading, the legal seal, the valuation line. The principal trust structure, the private holdings, and the protected reserve fall under my control, I said. Current value, a little over $28 million. Daniel actually blinked as if the room itself had shifted. Vanessa did not blink at all. That was the more revealing reaction. Her eyes moved once to the paper, then back to me, and in that one swift motion I watched every assumption she had built over the past week collapse and reorganize. This was not shock at my grief, not concern for my future. This was a woman realizing she had misread the board entirely. That is not possible, Daniel said, almost to himself. It is very possible, I answered. It is legal. It is documented. And it is none of your wife's business unless I choose to make it so. The air in the den changed. Even the fire seemed quieter. Vanessa's voice, when it came, was composed but thinner now. If that is true, why would you not tell us sooner? I looked at her and thought of the funeral, the fourth row seat, the whispers, the folder in my kitchen, the word comfortable used like a velvet rope around my own life. Because, I said, I wanted to see who would show me respect before they knew the number. Daniel dropped his gaze. Vanessa held mine, but only for a second before she, too, looked away. There. It was. Not a shouting victory. Not humiliation for its own sake. Just the quiet rearrangement of power back into its proper place. I slid the paper back into the folder and closed it. Here is what happens next, I said. Nothing gets signed unless Martin Hale reviews it. No one discusses selling this house unless I bring it up. No one contacts any institution on my behalf. And if either of you confuse access with authority again, you will find that Richard prepared for that as well. Daniel swallowed once and nodded. Vanessa did not nod. She simply sat very still, the way people do when they understand that every polished move they made too early is now part of someone else's evidence. After a while, Daniel stood. He thanked me for dinner, because habit survives humiliation longer than pride does. Vanessa rose a moment later and picked up the untouched bakery tart from the sideboard, then seemed to think better of it and left it there. I walked them to the front door. No one mentioned comfort. No one mentioned the house. No one mentioned help. When I closed the door behind them, the foyer fell into a silence so complete it felt almost ceremonial. I stood there with one hand on the brass knob and listened to their car back down the driveway. Richard had been right. The first person to treat me like an inconvenience had been the first to underestimate what he left in my hands. But he had not only left me money. He had left me the one thing they never thought I would use against them with such precision. Time. Enough time to let them reveal themselves. Enough time to say nothing until saying one number changed everything.